By 2:30 a.m., even as Russian forces were beginning to engage and destroy a mixed armored element in the north central portion of the installation at Fort Hood, simultaneously, another battle elsewhere in the installation was unfolding. As for the first 2.5 hours into the invasion, and including the battle at Fort Hood itself within the scope of the much larger nationwide invasion occurring, massive artillery barrages had been occurring throughout the entire installation, including conducted by the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade into a peninsular area of the installation jutting into Lake Belton, where there had been different mixed artillery forces conducting interoperability training amongst one another. These mostly comprising elements from 1st Cav, including the 2nd of the 82nd Field Artillery Regiment, which was a battalion, also the 3rd of the 16th Field Artillery Regiment, which was also another artillery battalion, and a single firing battery from the 1st of the 82nd Field Artillery Regiment, a different battalion, and Alpha Battery, or also referred to as King Battery, from the Steel Squadron, or essentially battalion, from 3rd ACR, which itself was different from the others, as the others were comprised of M109A6 Paladin self-propelled artillery howitzers, whereas the howitzers from the Alpha Battery of Steel Squadron, or King Battery, were comprised of M777 towed howitzers. Due to the enormous size of Fort Hood and the ample numbers of shells and rockets that were fired upon it, by 2.5 hours in, the vast majority of this peninsular area where all of these forces were dispersed and conducting their interoperability artillery training, firing into the geographic center of the post, which was the impact area, had occurred. These forces were by this point largely completely annihilated for the most part, as the suppression of enemy artillery operation, similar to the suppression of enemy air defense operation that occurred in the northeasternmost portion of the installation, had been a resounding success up to this point in the fighting, with the last portions of the combat against these forces wrapping up by sending in maneuver units in the form of a single armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion from the 112th Combined Arms Brigade of the PLA's 68th Group Army, as ample quantities of 122mm rockets fired from the 2 battalions within the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade's 2 battalions worth of PHL-81 truck-based multiple launch rocket systems had showered this large area in conjunction with howitzer fire from PLL-01 battalions, of which there were 2 within the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade, as well as the 152mm PLL-66 battalions, of which there were also 2. The PLL-01s, of course, being 155mm, which were comparable in size to the 152s. These were very large shells and could destroy very large areas when fired en masse in large salvos. After all, this particular peninsular area right here was approximately 15 miles north to south and about 8 miles east to west. It was a very large area of terrain and was saturated thoroughly with 122mm rockets and howitzer shells. Alpha Battery was all but entirely destroyed by this point, with most of the rest of these forces being completely obliterated as well by the artillery fire, scattering a very small number of surviving field guns from the 2nd of the 82nd, the 3rd of the 16th, and a few even from the single battery from the 1st of the 82nd, and sent them hurriedly trying to race out of this particular area, where they would now be intercepted by the maneuver forces of the two PLA battalions, one armored and one mechanized infantry, who by this point, as the main installation and West Fort Hood had all been but completely secured by this point by Sino-Russian forces, had time to set up to engage these fleeing forces, as the artillery fire, which had at this point been shifted to terrain denial fire, was now temporarily called off as other friendly forces moved into the area, with the company, the fire support company of the mechanized infantry battalion moving into the area, set up on the opposite side of the peninsula's mouth, essentially, which was right here, on the opposite side of the creek and Lake Belton recreation area, to set up an ambush, as well as the armored battalion moving straight ahead, beginning to fan out, with the rest of the mechanized infantry battalion doing the same, to entrap the fleeing forces within the peninsula and to utilize their ISR assets to coordinate the precise coordinates of the individual fleeing guns, as these presented very small targets when compared to the once larger batteries that they had been a part of. As the flight from the peninsula, from their firing positions while they were training, as they were being showered by artillery, was a flight conducted in sheer panic and done as a manner of simple survival, to try to get out of the hot zone and flee from the enemy fire. And again, as these were just individual howitzers fleeing the area in conjunction with support vehicles that made it out with only one full battery intact that hadn't been completely destroyed, fleeing as well, these forces were to be intercepted and destroyed by the maneuver units, and the precise coordinates of individual vehicles were to be found by the quadcopter micro-level reconnaissance assets that were operated by each and every individual squad-level element of the PLA forces taking part in the battle, therefore being able to thus direct more precise fires upon the fleeing American remains of their forces trying to leave this peninsula. As that was going to be carried out, the fire support company of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion was by this point completely set up on the opposite side of this particular body of Lake Belton right here, the body of water jutting in, comprising this part of the peninsula here, of the landmass that jutted into the lake. And they were comprised of shorter range light artillery systems, such as the light artillery multiple launch rocket systems of the 130mm Type 63 MLRS towed systems, as well as a single platoon of PLL-05 assault gun / mortar vehicles, which were self-propelled. These forces, by this point having been fully set up as the terrain denial fire was called off to allow these forces to flee the area to be intercepted and destroyed. A maneuver that was conducted brilliantly and resulted in a very small set-piece battle. As we go to the map, essentially at this point, at the opening of this map, the full single surviving artillery battery was fleeing the area and at the time had briefly stopped, and the howitzers, now taking fire from the armor, were essentially also being hit by the fire support company of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion on the opposite side of this small portion of Lake Belton, firing from the Lake Belton recreational area of Fort Hood. These being pavilions right here, and this being a paddle boat dock right here. Essentially, during more peaceful times, the service members at Fort Hood and their families could utilize this area as a recreational area to have picnics and enjoy themselves, but now it was turned into a battlefield. And on the other side of this water right here was training areas of the installation, opposite this creek right here that fed into the Lake Belton area right here. And essentially what occurred was, as these forces were fleeing in a panicked flight out of the peninsula, armored infantry troops of the armored battalion present with mechanized infantry forces of the same battalion that this fire support company was a part of, off map, fleeing or moving farther to the north to intercept fleeing American individual field guns or other vehicles or even individual troops that had abandoned their howitzers further in the peninsula when the artillery barrage that initiated hostilities had formally kicked them off. Essentially, this is one small segment of the larger battle, but this being perhaps where the vast majority of the action of the larger battle between the surviving artillery remains and the two maneuver battalions was occurring, as the full surviving artillery battery from one of the battalions that had been destroyed, this being a battery from the 2nd of the 82nd that survived the initial barrage, as they were further out of the peninsula when it began and were not hit immediately, giving them time to move out of the way of the fire. We're now in this position here being attacked by a single company spearheading the armored battalion, as the PLA armored battalion had 4 tank companies, an anti-tank company. It had 2 armored infantry companies and a headquarters and support company. And the mechanized infantry battalion had a headquarters and support company, a fire support company, which was these light artillery elements right here, and also 6 mechanized infantry companies, which were the rest of the mechanized infantry company was further to the north and off this particular map segment. This map segment essentially being, in terms of scale, a 2 by 2 mile area. So essentially at the point of this map, at the showing of it, artillery fire had resumed once again, along with loitering munitions entering from across Lake Belton, having had been fired from the headquarters battalion of the 112 Combined Arms Brigade from Nolanville, firing them into this area as they were within range to be able to do so effectively. And the artillery forces from the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade resuming their fire on the area after having had blocked the escape from the peninsula with a terrain denial mission, a bunch of different terrain denial fire missions. They had blocked escape for the surviving forces out of the area after having at first pummeled them to almost nothing, which was conducted until these maneuver elements moved to engage them while the other mechanized infantry battalion had been busy cordoning and sweeping to obtain control of the eastern segment of the main post, having it started from the headquarters building of 3 Corps and the installation itself, and moved east. At the same time, the air assault operation was conducted to seize the Hood Army Airfield, or the Eastern Airfield. These forces were essentially trapped after having had been largely reduced to almost nothing by the first few hours of firing. Were now trapped by fire missions that switched from destruction to terrain denial, blocking their escape, while these 2 maneuver battalions, with one clearing the eastern portions of the post, moving up to engage them, while also Russian forces from the large armored formation of 4 armored battalions, 4 armored infantry or mechanized infantry battalions of the 16th Tank Division, with their support assets in the form of 4 logistical support battalions from the 105th Logistical Support Brigade following up behind them as they were about to engage one of the final American units on the installation, which was the 1st of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, or 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, essentially, that also had been hit relatively hard at first while the firing missions shifted from destruction to terrain denial, preventing them from escaping into the wildlands and into the north, to be engaged and destroyed by Russian maneuver units, as the artillery strikes against them in particular had targeted their logistical elements as well as their command and control elements of their headquarters company or troop. As these forces were almost completely annihilated by artillery, the very few surviving elements that had been trapped by the terrain denial strikes on this peninsula were now being engaged and destroyed by the ground maneuver forces of the 2 Chinese battalions, the 2 PLA battalions. Although they tried to put up a fight, it essentially was hopeless at this point, as the fire support company belonging to the mechanized infantry battalion operating in the area was now firing their towed, having already had unhitched them from their supply vehicles that also towed the rocket pieces, firing volleys of 130 millimeter short-range rockets, or light artillery systems, essentially, from these Type 63 light multiple launch rocket systems across the way over this portion of the lake, and hitting these forces in conjunction with the mortar fire from their heavy 120 millimeter PLL-05 mortars, which were assault gun mortars, which could be fired directly as a direct fire weapon as an assault gun, or fired as a mortar system. And these 120 millimeter shells were a very large shell and were hitting these forces in the capacity of a mortar system as they were being fired upwards and over the area to hit them. This was the last surviving fully intact field artillery battery, but before they were completely destroyed by both a mixture of light artillery, loitering munitions, and artillery fire coming in now, with new coordinates being called in by the quadcopter reconnaissance drones of the armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalions, quadcopter reconnaissance drones assets at the squad level. They managed to fire some direct fire. They literally bore-sighted their howitzers and The crew members acted as fast as possible, loading. They knew they were going to be destroyed, but they loaded their howitzers and they fired one good volley at the Chinese tanks coming down the road that they were even able to see. And while some had loaded HE shells, there were two that loaded Copperhead anti-tank rounds, two of these that even had them, and they fired their Copperhead anti-tank rounds at these two Type 99A main battle tanks, and the Copperheads actually destroyed these two tanks, while the HE shells pretty much did nothing substantial to these others, but they inflicted some minor damage on them. But they destroyed two tanks. They managed to eliminate two Chinese tanks before all of the tank gunfire, in conjunction with the assault gun mortar fire, the MLRS light rocket artillery fire, and heavy artillery fire now being redirected upon these forces, completely hit and obliterated all of them. This was the full surviving battery right here that was completely destroyed, as well as loitering munitions hits. They were quickly this battle did not last long at all. And there were more coming in over the lake with the intent to hit these forces, but by the time they made it over the lake, it was too late, so the AI targeting on these directed them further to the north to hit other single lone guns that were fleeing the area, or groupings of troops that had since abandoned their howitzers when the original artillery fire had begun to come in and smash their batteries to nothing. They had abandoned their howitzers and were operating on foot. As 13 Bravo field artillery cannoneers had an automatic secondary MOS of 11 Bravo, essentially, as infantry, as they were used as such often in Iraq and other deployments as well. So essentially, these forces right here, these were 4 stray guns that had lost their whole batteries in the opening barrage. And they had moved over here with the attempt to fire directly at these forces up on the hill, but by the time they even moved into position to do it, artillery fire had been called upon them and was already blasting them into oblivion, with 2 imminently about to come in and hit right here, 2 shells, as indicated by these imminent strike artillery markers here, 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 and here. These were already impacting and destroying these artillery field guns, these M109A6 self-propelled Paladin artillery howitzer right here, these 4. And mortars, 120 millimeter mortar shells were hitting here, eliminating these artillerymen that had since abandoned their howitzers when the first fire came in upon them. When the opening of hostilities originated, these were survivors that had fled the area from the barrage that destroyed their vehicles. And by the time they were right here, the assault gun mortar fire came in and obliterated them with 3 hits around their positions, as occurred here with this wedge formation, 3 hits here. And this diamond formation of troops holding a position on this higher ground were cut up by fire from the Chinese armor. They had been fired at with a frag T shell or a fragmentation tank shell, and also by taking fire from coax machine guns in the form of 7.62 by 54 millimeter rounds, and also turret machine guns in the form of 12.7 millimeter rounds. Although the Americans tried to put up as good of a fight as they could, and even managed to have a small success by destroying 2 Chinese tanks, by this point it was all over with. This entire fight from beginning to end lasted around 10 minutes time. It was over extremely quickly. And this is just the main part of the fighting on this peninsula, as the mechanized infantry and other elements of the tank battalion fanned out to block the area and pick up the stragglers, destroying whatever few surviving vehicles managed to flee the area that survived the opening barrage that lasted 2.5 hours and was methodical, going up and down the whole peninsula, grid square by grid square, completely saturating this entire area. This was a huge area, and it saturated all of it with artillery in the span of a 2.5-hour time span. And there were very few vehicles that survived, and they were netted and destroyed by the maneuver units. Up here, all that there was left was 4 field guns, and these are their crew members trying to provide infantry support in a way to the flanks of these guns with their turret gunners on the 50 cal, the M250 cal that was on the top turrets of the crew serve of these field guns here. And there were 4 of them in a row here that were survivors from the different batteries, as there were 10 total batteries, including the M777 battery from 3rd ACR that were training together when the invasion had kicked off. But here comes in a loitering munition, a CH-901A, that hits and destroys this one right here. As these 3, including this one maneuvering around the destroyed one, continue ahead, they're being fired at by tank shells as well as being hit from their flanks by armored infantry dismounts, and these vehicles up on top of this higher ground firing down at them with 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire, and the ZBD-04As, which are the infantry fighting vehicles, firing 100 millimeter cannons, 30 millimeter autocannons, and even some HJ-08 missiles, anti-tank missiles from their side pods, completely destroying these vehicles. They didn't have much of a chance to fight back, although the dismounts had tried to fire at these dismounts, at these Chinese dismounts. They got in a small firefight early on with the turret gunners trying to fire at them, but they didn't have enough time to really do much of anything, as the IFV fire, tank shell fire, the loitering munition fire, and artillery fire beginning to hit behind them just completely wiped them out. Even by the time the last few surviving vehicles got here, they were completely destroyed by these loitering munitions coming in and hitting them at the same time as tank shells hit them, at the same time as IFV 100 millimeter shells hit them, 30 millimeter autocannon fire. I mean, they were gone. They were smoked. I mean, it happened quick. As you can see here, there's another. These loitering munitions, these CH-901As, were equipped with HE shells, as that was plenty to destroy vehicles and troops. And you can see this one is moving in here to support the dismounts of this armored infantry company that was moving into this area here to outflank these single vehicles that were from different batteries at the time the hostilities kicked off, that fled the area and managed to survive up until this point, as well as this whole battery getting hit by the Mechanized Infantry's Fire Support Company of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, having fired ample salvos of mortars, the 120 millimeter self-propelled mortar shells, also rocket fire. You can see these individual dismounted troops here getting hit by rockets and completely cut down by all the shrapnel from them, as well as mortar fire destroying the vehicles, and even single rockets getting hits on the sides of these howitzers and destroying them essentially. And this loitering munition, these were all dismounts in this prong right here. As they were running for their lives and trying to get out of the area, they were intercepted and cut down by these armored infantry forces firing their other vehicles off the map, firing at them, including infantry fighting vehicle fire, like the 100 millimeter shells, which cut these guys down in big groups, in conjunction with 30 millimeter autocannon fire, loitering munition hits, and of course small arms from the dismounts, as well as anti-personnel rounds from the nearly ubiquitous numbers of Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems that all these dismounts had available to them. They were firing anti-personnel rounds and even firing some of the anti-tank rounds that go with them at these vehicles here. And as they diligently picked up stragglers, with artillery helping them in this endeavor, as precise coordinates were radioed in upon these vehicles and dismounts, it was all over quick, as the fighting ended again between 10 and 15 minutes. I mean, it was roughly 10 minutes, but from the very beginning to the very end, it was about 15. It was thereabouts. It was over relatively fast. And these forces really didn't stand a chance. And again, although they fought very hard, and they had heart. They didn't last long, and the Copperhead fired anti-tank rounds were the only reason they were even able to get two of the PLA tanks. But other than that, the HE rounds just hit the ground in front of these vehicles and caused a lot of damage, but they didn't destroy the tanks. They caused minor damage to the tanks, but they caused a lot of damage to the ground in front of them. But the Copperheads were mainly what could destroy these tanks, but these vehicles only had a few of them available, so they used their Copperheads and destroyed two of the Type 99A Chinese main battle tanks that they could see coming down the road here. And the sheer combination of all the different fire coming in is what made this battle last such a short amount of time. It was so short that, in fact, there really wasn't even any time to call in close air support even. Not that they even needed it, but if they were considering calling in close air support, but from beginning to end, this lasted such a short amount of time, there was just no need for it. So by the time it was even radioed in and was flying over the area, it was all over with, and they were diverted elsewhere. As by this point in the battle, by 2:45, the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft that were in the area that were earmarked specifically to this battle haven't as of yet completely did an RTB, as there were still two of them that hadn't even had dropped their payloads yet. And also the J-11s had done one RTB at this time to refuel and reload their aircraft, as they had all in the opening hour used up all their firepower. So by the time of 2:30, they had done their RTB the short distance by flight. It was a short flight distance between Fort Hood and Mexico in terms of time, and they were able to stay in the air as a result much longer than were they operating much, much further deep inland. And the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft carried vastly more fuel than did the fighters or ground attack aircraft that were much smaller aircraft with much smaller fuel tanks. And thus, the H-6K heavy strategic bombers could stay airborne for far longer when they were only this short of a distance in terms of flight distance from their bases. And there were two still operating in the area that hadn't as of yet dropped their payloads, whereas the J-11s had done their RTB already one time and were now operating over the area freshly reloaded with air-to-ground munitions, as well as their FH-97A wingman drones, or the drone fighters that accompanied them, with one having had been destroyed early on in a freak occurrence with the pulling up out of an area where flares had deceived the man-portable shoulder-fired Stinger missile systems fired by American air defense troops that ended up hitting one of the FH-97As, which, of course, this early on hasn't been replaced yet, but there were still other ones accompanying the other aircraft of this particular squadron that was earmarked to this specific battle. And they had all been reloaded and were operating over the area, again, including a close air support mission called in to assist the Russians at the other battle that was occurring concurrently to this one, which was occurring in the northwest central portion of the installation against mixed armored forces, as had been explored in the previous video of this documentary series. Now, as this fighting was wrapping up, the one Chinese armored battalion present, this only being one tank company of the whole battalion, as there were three other tank companies, two armored infantry companies, their anti-tank company, and their headquarters company, as well as the different companies comprising the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, besides this fire support company that was part of that Mechanized Infantry Battalion, which was mostly north of this area in this part of the peninsula to net any Americans fleeing the area, were now, having had intercepted the straggling vehicles that had fled from the earlier barrage that completely saturated most of the peninsula, they had intercepted and destroyed the fleeing vehicles after the artillery fire that had fixed the remaining forces in place in order to be intercepted as these forces moved in for the kill. After that had been raised, only to be restarted again as a support fire mission for these forces moving in, that the fire had shifted from saturation to terrain denial to pen in the fleeing forces from the earlier saturation operation, to now, from terrain denial to keep them from escaping the area, had shifted to precision strike. So 3 different types of fire missions had been fired at these forces on this peninsula, with the precision strike coming in completely to assist the maneuver units that were now netting all of the fleeing forces. Most of them were dismounts, as in like infantry type forces at this point, but of the vehicle forces that survived, including the one completely intact battery of the 2nd of the 82nd and the handful of different field guns from the 2nd of the 82nd's other batteries, the 3rd of the 16th's batteries, most of which had been completely obliterated, and the 1st of the 82nd's one firing battery, which had one field howitzer that escaped with its life from the earlier saturation attacks, the fire missions. They had all been intercepted at this point, destroyed, and now the 2 maneuver battalions tasked with intercepting and destroying the fleeing survivors were now going to move in and conduct a BDA on this peninsula and secure it properly, while Russian forces from their main armored thrust of 4 armored battalions, 4 armored infantry battalions from their 16th Tank Division, and the 4 support and logistical battalions from the 105th Logistical Support Brigade moving deep into the installation to continually provide them with logistical aid, were peeling off in some different directions, with 1 armored battalion peeling off this way just to the south of this company of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion that was tasked with cleaning up the peninsular area where all of these forces had once been, with the rest of their forces traveling north to engage and destroy the 1st of 3rd ACR, the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, or the 1st of the 3rd, with others peeling off north of this mixed American battalion-sized element, consisting of armored forces from 2 different battalions, or actually 3 rather, that had been conducting armored training near the impact area of the installation, firing live tank shells into it and practicing maneuver training, that were about to be engaged by PLA forces towards the end of the main fighting of this battle, within the first 4 hours of it, when all the main fighting had taken place, which would taper into the final 8 hours of the battle just being a massive cleanup effort of the installation, trying to net all these small, tiny groupings of survivors from these once larger battalion-sized elements that had fled and escaped into the wilderness throughout the post. The next battle to occur after this one had wrapped up was fighting occurring from that Russian armored thrust into the installation, where most of their armored forces continued to the northeast before they would shift out of the installation to pursue earlier fleeing that fled at the beginning of hostilities, that were wise enough to flee, these American forces from the 91st Brigade Engineer Battalion, these mixed infantry forces that were practicing patrol training at the near North Fort Hood here, and the 4th of the 9th Cav here, the 2nd Squadron of 3rd ACR here. These Russian forces would end up pursuing them although they had a head start out of the post, they were moving in a slinky type effect again due to the fact that they had no communications, no redundant communications. The radio had been disrupted by jamming, and also the anti-satellite and cyber strikes having had occurred at the very beginning of the invasion itself, which affected the entire country and military of the USA. These Russian forces, upon defeating the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, would continue to pursue these forces fleeing out of the installation, some of which they were not fully aware that I-35 would have been heavily guarded, and as they go off the map here and towards I-35, they would be engaged and destroyed by PLA units of the 68th Group Army, which were also north of this map and engaging in the battle that occurred simultaneously at Waco, and would intercept and destroy these forces fleeing towards I-35, whereas most of the rest would continue straight north and into the Waco area that way, being pursued by Russian forces from the 16th Tank Division that would continue out of the installation, whereas the rest of the forces of the 16th would stay on it, with the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade doing the same to help the elements of the 68th PLA Group Army still on the installation with cleaning up the training areas of any residual small groupings of American troops after the last of the major combat elements in the training areas were formally defeated, which included the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR and also this mixed grouping of armored forces from 1st Cav that were conducting interoperability training right here near the geographic middle of the installation, at which time by 3 a.m. the Chinese forces, the Combat Engineer Battalion and Armored Battalion, the other Armored Battalion of the 1112th Combined Arms Brigade, or the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, they would be moving into this area from having conducted a brief logistical pause just north of the Robert Gray Army Airfield before moving to strike these forces that were still within this area, while the Russian armored forces moving to engage the 1st of the 3rd ACR, or 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, peeled off a few battalions to block any escape if these forces so chose to try to escape, whereas most of the rest of the forces of that total of 12 battalions would strike directly to the northeast against these forces, which were now fixed in position by other Chinese terrain denial strikes to prevent them from fleeing east or northeast, as well as Chinese forces in the form of the other armored battalion of 2 armored battalions and an air defense battalion. They're close-in air defense battalion of the 17th Armored Brigade that struck in here early on to carry out the SEAD, or Suppression of Enemy Air Defense operation, leaving the other armored battalion to guard their rear flank as they carried out this attack, and the air defense artillery battalion with them. So they were blocked off from the north, and they were blocked off from the east of escape. So the Russians were coming in from the south and southwest to head northeast to engage and destroy them before pursuing the earlier having fled American units that were now past Gatesville and were moving towards Waco, where that other battle was occurring with other elements of the 68th PLA Group Army, which was happening simultaneously to this battle. This was a nationwide invasion, and many, many battles this early on were happening concurrently, simultaneously. This was only at this point in the battle, after this battle had wrapped up and this one was still going on slightly, from between 2:30 and 3, this battle was happening, and between 2:30 and 2:45, this battle was happening. This battle would start at 2:45 and would last until 3:15, with this battle starting at 3:15 and ending by 4. This was an enormous operation to capture an enormous installation with ample fighting left to go, as the entire battle itself would end at 12 noon on the 4th of October, although the last 8 hours of the fighting would be far less severe than the first 4. The fighting wouldn't officially be over until 12 noon, with this being the longest single military installation engagement in the entire South Central invasion sector, simply due to its sheer geographic size and number of forces on it that would have to be thoroughly methodically cleared. It would take an ample amount of time to do so, as Fort Hood was full of all types of varied terrain, topography, and its sheer size and number of forces would cause the clearance of it to last a full 12 hours from the beginning of the invasion at midnight on the 4th to noon on the 4th. A full 12 hours. Although much of the major fighting would wrap up by 4 a.m., the residual combat would go on until noon. Next is the battle against the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR.